Medicine is the science by which we learn the various states of the human body. In health, when not in health, the mean by which health is likely to be lost, and when lost, is likely to be restored to her. Ibn Sina, the canon, undoubtedly Avicenna is one of the great physicians in Islam and one of the greatest thinkers and medical scholars in history. Ibn Sina was born in 980 Andomini, near Bukhara in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, and died in 1037 in Iran. He was born at a time of chance and uncertainty in the Muslim world. He began his studies in medicine at the age of 13.
He became a distinguished physician, and his medical expertise brought him to the attention of the Sultan of Bukhara, and whom he treated successfully for a serious infection. As a reward, he asked only that he be given permission to use the Sultan's library and its rare manuscripts, allowing him to continue his research. He was associated with multiple short-lived sultanates, but relocated often, researching for a stable, well-paying position. At various times, he worked as political administrator, court physician, soldier, and occasional outcast and prisoner. During his hectic life, he managed to write nearly 100 books, one of which was Al-Qanun fi al-Tib, or the Canon of Medicine, and which was first translated to Latin in the 12th century, becoming the standard textbook of medicine in European medical schools, and continued to be consulted in the Muslim world well into the 20th century. William Osler described the Canon as the most famous medical textbook ever written, noting that it remained a medical Bible for a longer time than any other work.
From the autobiographical sketch that has come Dantes, we learn that Ibn Sina was precocious. At the age of 10, he knew the Quran by heart. Before he was 16, he had mastered physics, mathematics, logic, and metaphysics, and began the study and practice of medicine. At the age of 21, he wrote his famous canon, which remained the principal authority in medical schools, both in Europe and in Asia, for several centuries. He served successfully several Persian potentates as physician and advisor, traveling with them from place to place. Although he was known to be sociable, he was studious and serious, devoting much he devoting much of his time to reading.
The Canon. Ibn Sina is known through the work as Avicenna. His book, The Canon, surveyed the entire medical knowledge available from ancient and Muslim sources at the time in a clear and organized summary. It was originally written in Arabic and later translated into several languages, including Persian, Latin, Chinese, Hebrew, German, French, and English. In addition to bringing together then available knowledge, the book is rich with the author's original contribution. The Canon of Medicine set the standards for medicine in Europe and the Islamic world. It is Ibn Sina's most renowned work alongside the Book of Healing. Much of the book also formed the basis of Unani Greek medicine, a form of traditional medicine still taught in Islamic universities in India, the three plus of medicine described by the canon than centuries ago are still taught at UCLA and Yale University, among others, as part of the histories of medicine.
Avicenna's important original contribution include such advances as recognition of the contagious nature of tuberculosis, spread of disease by water and soil, and interaction between psychology and health. In addition to describing pharmacological methods, the book described 760 drugs and became the most authentic materia medica of the era. He wrote a book on cardiac drugs, Al-Adwiyat al-Qalbiyah, which was translated to English as Avicenna's Tract on Cardiac Drugs and Essays on Arab Cardiotherapy. He was also the first to describe meningitis and made rich contribution to anatomy, gynecology, and child health. Avicenna as a psychiatrist. Avicenna often used psychological methods to treat his patients. One anecdote was when a malnourished prince of Persia had melancholia, refused to eat, and suffered from the delusion that he was a cow. The prince would moo like a cow, crying, "Kill me so that a good stew may be made of my flesh," and would not eat anything. Ibn Sina was persuaded to the case and sent a message to the patient, asking him to be happy, as the butcher was coming to slaughter him, and the sick man rejoiced. When Ibn Sina approached the prince with a knife in his hand, he asked, "Where is the cow, so I may kill it?"
The peasant, the moved like a cow to indicate where he was, by order of the butcher. The peasant was also laid on the ground for slaughter. When Ibn Sina approached the peasant, pretending to slaughter him, he said, "The cow is too lean and not ready to be killed. It must be fed properly, and I will kill it when it becomes healthy and fat." The peasant was then offered food, which he ate eagerly and gradually gained strength, got rid of his delusions, and was completely cured. The pulse, every bit of the pulse comprises two movements and two pauses. Thus, expansion, pause, contraction, pause. Avicenna, the canon.
As a cardiologist, I was drawn to Avicenna's descriptions of the pulse. Taking the pulse is one of simplest, oldest, and most informative of all clinical examination. It is a key diagnostic method in most medical traditions, particularly ancient Egyptian medicine, Chinese traditional medicine, Greco-Islamic, and Ayurveda medicine. Throughout the history of medicine, the pulse was an important parameter in assessing cardiac dysfunction, and the tactile examination of the pulse was referred to as the messenger that never fails. The character of the pulse is still one of the most important diagnostic clues in modern medicine. Feeling and interpreting the pulse requires great skill. Pulse taking was a skillful bedside technique in Greco-Islamic medicine and the Middle Ages.
The pulse and lovesickness. The learned physician should read the happiness and misery of the body by feeling the pulse at the root of the thumb, which stand as the witness of the soul. Sanskrit law. One element in the history of making medicine where pulse taking is extremely useful was love sickness. Love sickness is an illness that permeates the history of medicine since the time of Hippocrates. Greek physicians considered falling in love a disease that may lead to death. Historically and traditionally, we have metaphorically attributed the feelings and emotion as if they actually originated from the heart. The tradition goes back thousands of years and has enriched our language and literary heritage.
It is a very impressive piece of work. I was quite amazed. Did he personally observe all that, or he compiled various observations from various sources? In the English translation that I read, Dr. Cameron Gruner, the translator, has extensive commentary and comparison to ancient sinus palpation and passages from Galen and other Greek medical writers. So it is very likely that Avicenna compared them. Nevertheless, it is a remarkable piece of work.
Pulses out of the canon. Pulses taking has evolved in our time to a highly sophisticated digital beat-to-beat display with blood oxygen monitoring to aid us in making a diagnosis. Hence, careful examination of the pulse is frequently overlooked, even though pulse taking is low-tech and inexpensive. Thorough examination of the pulse can provide a lot of information and help form an accurate diagnosis. As students in medical school and during residency training, we were taught that assessment of the arterial pulse characteristic is an integral part of the cardiovascular examination. Carotid, radial, brachial, femoral, posterior tibial, and dorsalis pedis pulse should be routinely examined bilaterally to ascertain any difference in the pulse amplitude, contour, or upstroke. Who can remember all the different pulse findings in chronic severe aortic insufficiency? The textbooks describe 10, yet I remember only 3. Corrigan's pulse, Bisferian's pulse, and Waterhammer.
Imagine my shock and surprise on reading Avicenna the Pulse in the Canon, a special edition of the Classic of Medicine Library from the collection of Dr. H.A. Hajar al-Binali, who kindly lent me his copy. The title reads, A Treatise on the Canon of the Medicine of Avicenna, incorporating a translation of the first book by Kramer Gruner, M.D. Long, and published in 1930. The section on the pulse is the most detailed and lucid discussion on the features, and characteristics of the pulse that I have ever read. Of course, one can find numerous summaries and commentaries on Avicenna pulse doctrine on the internet and in articles published in medical journals, but you want to get the sense of everything, you get one reading the original.
It is a very impressive piece of work. I was quite amazed. Did he personally observe all that, or he completed various observations from various sources? In the English translation that I read, Dr. Cameron Gunner, the translator, had extensive commentary and comparison to ancient sinus palpation and passages from Galen and other Greek medical writers. So, it is very likely that Avicenna completed them. Nevertheless, it is our remarkable piece of work.
The pulse section consists of 39 pages and covers the definition of the pulse, technique in feeling the pulse, reasons for feeling the pulse at the wrist,
the emotional state of the patient and the observer, characteristic of the pulse with detailed explanation, discusses normal from abnormal pulse, the varieties of irregularity, effect of age and gender on the pulse, effect of emotion and personality, effect of the seasons, effects of food and drink, effect of sleep, the pulse during exercise, the pulse in pregnancy, the pulse in pain, and the pulse in inflammation. The most interesting is the description on the 10 features in the pulse. In Ibn Sina's classification, we recognize certain types of arrhythmias such as atrial fibrillation, premature, and rapid beats. He also described different pulses similar to pulses being observed in arterial and ventricular arrhythmias.
He described more than 50 identifiable pulses. He distinguished two kinds of irregular pulses: regularly irregular or irregularly irregular, and that the difference might be difficult to appreciate. He compared the rhythm of an irregular pulse to the flight of the gazelle, the pulsus gazellans. The rat-tail pulse described by Ibn Sina is similar to what is known as pulsus alternate secondary to weakened myocardium. You may feel a strong pulse followed by a faint pulse. As if you pass your hand on the rat, you feel the body. Then the tails feel small compared to the body. Undulating pulse, dicrotic pulse, and ventricular pulse are a few examples of different types of pulse that were described by him.
Ibn Sina also compared pulse rhythms to musical rhythm. The musical character of the pulse didn't escape his attention, for he was an accomplished food. Some of these pulse descriptions are written in the form of Arabic poetry. The canon was written in Arabic. It has been over 1,000 years since Ibn Sina described the characteristics of a normal and abnormal pulse and how environmental and various conditions and stimuli affect the pulse. His thesis on the pulse is remarkable, and many of his remakes of the pulse are still true today, but pathological correlation was absent.
What is felt by the fingers must be described to give shades of meaning to a purely subjective perception, and science scholars often resorted to comparing pulse rhythm to the motion of animals, and Ibn Sina was no exception. As already mentioned, he compared the rhythm of an irregular pulse to the flight of a gazelle, or pulsus gazellans, and this was described earlier by Galen as the leap of a god. Or pulsus capricens, reading such pulse metaphors is rather charming but no longer helpful in our technical-oriented world. Nevertheless, against a background of modern knowledge, I still find Ibn Sina's pulse description extraordinary. Thank you.
It is therefore not surprising to find that Ibn Sina's descriptions of the pulse have been described by the Greeks before, most notably by Galen, who controlled medical thinking for centuries. Galen's teaching on the pulse dominated clinical practice for about 16 centuries. Some of his books on the pulse have been lost, but 18 books are known to be extant and are regarded as authentic. Many journal articles have reproduced Galen's descriptions. The writer finds the similarity in the doctrines and descriptions of the pulse by Galen and Ibn Sina quite striking and startling. Clearly, Ibn Sina subscribed to Galen's pulse doctrines.
What is felt by the fingers must be described to give shades of meaning to a purely subjective perception. Ancient scholars often resorted to comparing pulse rhythms to the motion of animals, and Ibn Sina was no exception. As already mentioned, he compares the rhythm of an irregular pulse to the flight of a gazelle or pulsus gazellans, and this was described earlier by Galen as the leap of a goat, or pulsus capricans. Reading such pulse metaphors is rather charming, but no longer helpful in our technical-oriented world. Nevertheless, against a background of modern knowledge, I still find Ibn Sina's pulse description extraordinary.
Conclusions: Avicenna was a product of the rich intellectual, cultural, and scientific ferment that swept the Islamic world. He created a complete philosophical system in the Arabic language. Among the great sages of Islamic medicine, Ibn Sina is the best known in the West. Considered as the successor to Galen, his great medical treatise, the Canon, was the standard textbook on medicine in the Arab world and Europe in the 17th century. He was a philosopher, physician, psychiatrist, and poet. Like Galen, he devoted a large portion of his work to the study of the pulse, and his contribution to the field of speechology were significant. Avicenna comprehensively covers the subject of the pulse, describes the technique of pulse taking, and records the effects of a variety of conditions on the pulse, such as environment, physical condition of patient, and emotional states such as anger, pleasure, joy, grief, and fear. Like Galen, he described 10 features in the pulse and more than 50 identifiable pulses.
He described different pulses similar to the pulse being overshot in the arterial and verticular arrhythmias. According to Avicenna, vital power, resistance, and elasticity were important in the quality, size, and volume of the pulse. He defined concepts such as resistance and elasticity in the physiological manner. Feeling the pulse is simple, fast, and inexpensive, and is still a very useful diagnostic technique. Ibn Sina description and concepts on the pulse are the foundation for our current state of the art knowledge on the pulse, arrhythmia, and electrophysiology. It is of course impossible for physicians to note all the characteristic of the pulse on palpation as described by Ibn Sina 1,000 years ago, but still many of his observations on the pulse in health and disease are valid today.
Although many Western historians used to believe that the Arabs were merely transmitters of great achievement, it cannot be denied the Islamic philosophy, science, and physicians added their own observation and wisdom to the knowledge that they accrued from more ancient civilization. They made many original contributions to mathematics, astronomy, physics, alchemy, optics, pharmacology, and medicine. Ibn Sina may have been a follower of Galen, but he made many pioneering contributions. History agree that he is one of the greatest thinkers and medical scholar in history. He is called and the prince of physicians of his era.